Good afternoon. So I'd like to welcome to the interview slot today Jane Balen from the Board Risk Management and Pete Allison from County Business Shows and quite a few other things which we hear about at various times. So today we're going to talk about thought leadership. So my first question to both of you is, when you hear the term thought leadership, what does it make you think of? Jane, would you like to go first?
Absolutely. For me, it makes me think of um, the the people who are at the forefront of my specialism, which is HR and reward, the people who are leading forward the way that we do things and keeping us abreast of what important changes are going on in the world.
Pete, what would you add to that?
Yeah, so I think when I hear the word thought leadership, I think because my own background comes from a little bit of the performance and entertainment world, I just leap to think about somebody standing on stage trying to be very inspirational. And the little bit of me in that then challenges that and says, why are you on that stage and being inspirational about that? So I then sort of explode that out, and just thinking about this interview has been quite interesting. What do I think about thought leadership? Not what do I think about someone standing on stage talking to me. What do I think about thought leadership? And that's quite challenging when you think about it for more than literally 5 seconds, because it says who do you respect? How do you validate their views? Where do you draw your information from? For me, actually, when I think about it, I probably go to the media. And not that I'm going to say I'm persuaded all about the BBC, but the BBC is a very respected platform for BBC Verify, which is sense checking what's going on. So I guess the real answer is I tend to think about trusted media outlets and making my mind up. But there are a lot of people out there who will have a view, and you go, yeah, that makes sense, or possibly not.
So Jane, in terms of, Pete's mentioned where he gets some of his sort of input from, if you like. What about for you? Where do you look for thought leadership, ideas and?
Yeah, I tend to go and use more frequently social media, not necessarily the Facebooks and Instagram side of things, but more likely to be things like what's going on YouTube or the TEDx talks, or the TED talks that you get, or things like who's very visible on LinkedIn, what sort of things are new and different, who are presenting even old ideas in new and interesting ways, that sort of thing. So for me, it's not necessarily about the tried and trusted sources, but also about, investigating and getting to the bottom of some of the newer sources and seeing if what's coming on there makes sense.
So do you find it's something that you actively look for? Or is it something that just sort of happens? Or is it a mixture?
It's a mixture. I was laughing at this question when I was looking at it, and I was thinking to myself, this is a really interesting question, because sometimes something will flash up either on a LinkedIn news feed, on the news, or just in a magazine, an article, and it'll send me off, not down a rabbit hole, but down a research route. And the work that I do for my clients involves me being ahead of the game in terms of research. I'm always researching something, whether it's salaries, the best benefits to offer, or whatever it is. So I go off down the research route looking to see what's going on. And, the internet's a great place to start, to find that sort of thing. But as Pete says, you've got to make sure you're using reputable sources. And that you're not just going for anything that's on there. So it's always a bit about, A, what are people saying, and then B, who's saying it and why are they so important in saying that.
And so Pete, you talk about, using trusted sources like the big. Do you think you are specifically looking for thought leadership, or is that almost a byproduct of seeing information about all sorts of different things, some of which will be thought leadership and some of which won't?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think my absorption and looking at thought leadership context stuff in the way we're talking doesn't tend to be organized, doesn't tend to be driven by emotion. Probably less so sometimes than it should be. But then I've never been a particularly academic person. I've never been driven. I learn experientially.
Yeah.
But and I've probably got myself into more holes and problems than either I should have done over the years, or possibly even could have done if I'd actually taken a bit more time and learned a bit more about it, and thereby hangs a tail. but we're all different. We're all individuals. We all learn in our own ways. But what I have had, and I guess this is where this sort of falls to answer a question, is that in the course of the years, especially working in touring shows with people and things on stages, and also what we're doing with the shows now, and also lots of other instances, I've ended up meeting with on a one-to-one relational basis and sitting through night on night of really interesting stuff at different times. And actually, that by a process of osmosis has led me to what I look back now and regard as some really good places. Did I go and seek them out? No, they came and sort of found me. And that's maybe just a very happy set of circumstances. It could easily have been the other way, but that probably is why, I will tend by default in the office to have Radio 4 on. I'm not always able to actually pay attention, but and then you have some of the things, things that's been going on in Gaza and Israel just now, and then stuff that's going on in Europe and what have you. And you take on a lot of information, and only 10% of it actually gets home. But it's that 10% which then takes you to a place where you form a view.
Yeah.
And hopefully that view is being tempered by volume of what you've taken on board and things. It's interesting. As I mentioned very briefly earlier, my son's a serving officer in the forces, and every now and again when he's home, something's going on, and he'll sit down when it's just the two of us. You say, "What do you reckon about this thing?" And you have that that there's that professional edge. I'm never really going to know quite why it's crossed his world, but he's obviously been thinking about it and he's interested in a take on it. And that's really fascinating, because you think, well, actually, what have I been catching up with? And thus it all goes on round one more time, if you see what I mean.
So where does social media fit into leadership, Jane?
Yeah. I think it's just another route to getting more information. It's got to be used with a big degree of circumspect. But it is a route to more information. I'm gonna be really techie here. Really sorry, people, but this topic got me off on looking down some stats from the internet, and that led me back to the ONS and some stats on there. So I think we can pretty much accept that they're fairly reasonable. But these are about users of the internet in the UK.
Yeah.
And the purpose of it, and it was interesting things like social networking, Facebook and Twitter. It's sort of like 90% of 25 to 30 to 44-year-olds use Facebook and Twitter, and if that drops down to 58% when you get to 55. So there's kind of like that social media thing is there, and it's very much being used. The younger generations are probably cleverer about using it. But use it more,
or not, as the case may be, yeah.
or not maybe. And things like video content from YouTube,
Yeah.
the younger generations. The interesting thing is that they've also got the stats by male and female, and in terms of the social media sites like LinkedIn and those sorts of sites, then women use them more often than men do, and things like video content, men more often than women.
That's interesting, isn't it? I wonder if it's difficult to know, I suppose, with just the numbers, though, whether people are looking for the influencers or whether that's actually more about connection and interaction than perhaps thought leadership as such. So because there's a mixture of business people and non-business people in there, so it's a really interesting stat there.
Yeah, I'd like to have seen it broken down more into things like LinkedIn as well, so that you could get a clearer understanding, because I think LinkedIn is acknowledged kind of business side.
Platform. It was interesting. I saw an article on LinkedIn the other day around the top 10 influencers in the world online, and I didn't know any of them.
Yeah, I think
it says it all, really.
Huge part to play. If you think like Martin Lewis is a social influencer, and he's doing two things. He's helping individuals to spend their money more wisely, and he's encouraging organizations to be more aware of their impact. So I think there's, he's got a huge influence in two directions.
So that leads me to the next question: is how important is it, and where does credibility fit into this, Pete? Because as James mentioned, there's so much information that is available to us, but how do we pick through and look at the authority of it, rather than we're all worried about fake news and stuff? But is that same true in the thought leadership space?
Yeah, but I mean, and is it even differentiable? What's the word there, isn't there? How, and can you differentiate it from the thought leadership space? I think, well, you know, when I put together programs for these shows and things, so I spend a little bit of time sometimes just mulling over what is it that we should be saying, what can we be saying, how, what are the things we ought to be getting in there. And I think at a macro level, the whole world of social media and thought leadership does trouble me. That's me, you know, it doesn't have to trouble everybody. And I think credibility and wisdom, which is probably just another way of saying credibility, but from a slightly more empathetic way, is the core of that. I think if you're absorbing social media info and insights from an educated and balanced and well-reasoned position, and you have the ability and the self-confidence, and that's a significant thing here, to say, you're having a laugh, mate, move on, you know, then it gets quite healthy, because you can listen to comments and views that may not be that sensible, and you can evaluate them in your own right, and then you can make a balanced decision. But the problem we've got is that that's not a description that fits everything and everyone, and there are a number of reasons for that. Social media is so ubiquitously present everywhere. So you've got issues from you start with the obvious one, which is the age demographic. And, you know, we on a number of areas, you have seasoned people with life experience trying to take decisions on behalf of young people through their lens without, you know, but their version of young person was, you know, 20 and 30 and 40 years ago. How can you possibly actually understand the experience that that young person is having? And yet that young person is you know, absorbing a vast amount of information without credibility checks. So there's a real sort of question mark around that. We all use and are familiar with the term social media influencers. Now that's interesting. The clue's in the title: influencer, not you know, absolutely verified information. So you don't have a news influencer on the BBC or wherever else. You have a news reader, and there's a really important differential in that phraseology that's significant. That's not to say influencers, and I mean Jane referenced them, Martin, his name's going out of my head, but
Martin
Lewis, who, you know, is the most incredibly experienced, sensible and well motivated guy, and you know, there aren't many people who could take the government to task in the way he did and does. So I would be the last one to throw out the baby with the bathwater in terms of influencers. But you asked me a question about credibility, and I don't know the answer to that, and I think that's very dangerous. And as we move into the world of AI, not that I want to start off down that rabbit warren, because that's a major rabbit warren that we're playing with at the moment. But, you know, good, bad, and the ugly, well, this is all part of the potential ugly side of AI as well. So that's not a very conclusive answer, but I'm not sure there even is one.
So Jane, going slightly tangential, so how important do we think that critical thinking is in terms of thinking about thought leadership?
And I think that was going to be my next point, having just listened to Pete. I think I was just going to say, critical thinking, our ability to assess and challenge what we hear is hugely important. It's got to be in this. But I think I may be coming from a slightly different perspective from Pete, in that I see a generation and working with some Gen Zs recently that is much more questioning about the information they're given. Much more questioning. We used to take education at school. I can remember just sitting and absorbing everything they told me and seeing it as fact, right up until the point where I went to my first medieval festival and discovered that you can do somersaults in a suit of armour. But you know, we were taught not to question our teachers. We were taught to just learn information from our teachers. And there are still many teachers who go by that same philosophy, but there are a lot more youngsters out there now questioning what they've been told and doing their own research and coming to their own conclusions about what they see and hear and are taught, and being taught to think critically and question and challenge what they hear. So I kind of, I'm not quite so, I'm loath to use the word gloomy as Pete about it.
Yeah, can I just sort of, I agree with you. I've got my youngest is 21, my oldest is 26, but my two younger ones who are beyond that sort of young teenage absorb it anyway level, but they are very challenging in what they're thinking. And most of the time they would come to a very strong conclusion, especially my youngest one. It's not always the right conclusion. And so she will challenge, but sometimes you have to say, well, but why about that?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's fine. That's part of life. That's part of growing up. And from my perspective, it's part of parenting. And I do absolutely read you when you say there's a lot more challenging going on. The other aspect, though, when I was just answering that last question, I said, the obvious one is the age demographic. Probably a major thing is, of course, we're not all on the same plane in terms of the ability to critically assess. And if you move into an EDI space here in a staff workplace, and actually you've got a whole other level there as well. So referencing Jill's basic level of question, is critical assessment, critical thinking important? Absolutely it is. How do you support and encourage critical so that you're not trying to shut ideas down, but you are trying to make sure that they have the right airing and even way of dealing with people who may not be as bright as some others and may not get that there's another side to that story. That's what bothers me a little bit.
Okay. So as you mentioned, there is clearly an age demographic, but clearly there's there's cultural demographics and perhaps gender and all sorts of things that affect how people consider thought leadership, whether they seek it out or whether it just happens to them and that it's something they slowly take on board by almost osmosis. But how do you think as businesses we can reflect that in how we deal with the world, deal with our customers, deal with our employees, deal with our suppliers? Are the flags that we really need to think about, potentially more in the emotional intelligence space, that say, actually, this is actually about there's some thought leadership activities going on in here inherently. How do we make sure there's a quality output from it, Pete?
Yeah, so that's really important, and that plays into there's a thread that we're working on about immigration and business, and actually multicultural. And the fascinating thing when you get a multicultural workplace, and actually the strength that can bring to a business, and and just because as somebody who owns a business and you're in a totally executive controlling position, ultimately you can stamp your foot and say it's my business, it happens this way. If you are aware of the broad cultural spread of a business, then actually you absorb the ideas, and actually think about it, you widen out your ability to talk to different customers. So there's logical business thinking there. But to answer your question, in order to do that, you have to be aware of the thought leadership aspects. Not that you think of them like that. When you have someone from a different culture or a different age range or a different, part of life that you're natural to, understanding to make it an inclusive workplace, to actually not just feel that there's somewhere where they earn their money and get home at the end of the day because they need to do that, but actually somewhere where they are properly absorbed and contributing to the life and soul of the business. You've got to take on board the space they're coming from, and not just in a tolerant way from your position, but actually getting under the skin and understanding it. And that brings with it a responsibility to be aware of. I'm not saying spend hours working out why their thought leaders are, but at least have an emotionally intelligent angle that says, but you don't see it that way. I understand that. Let's embrace what you're looking at, and we'll try and work out what the right thing for the business is.
And so, Jane, from your point of view, because you're working with businesses in that reward risk management, and I'm thinking about the risk part almost in a way. Are the ways that businesses can really take this sort of thing on board and really change how their businesses and their workforce interact?
And I think for me, quite often the phrase I use is take the risk of asking them what they think. I mean, once upon a time we did staff surveys and the responses were kind of shoved under the table and nobody got it out in case you opened a can of worms and discovered everybody hated the CEO. Well, what's news there? So there's never any news in a survey. Everybody knows what's going on. So I say to people, take the risk of communicating and asking what's going on with your workforce and what's important to them when you're doing this. And I think particularly from the employer's viewpoint, we're seeing a lot more of that as a result of both COVID and the need to drive a better workforce experience.
Mm.
So I think, but I think when we ask staff how to do things better, what can we do to make things better? How can we improve our processes? How can we drive better performance in the business? They often come up with solutions that we just haven't thought of. And if we shut down their ability to communicate in that way, we shut down that thought leadership that comes from having diversity in the workforce.
Yeah. So an interesting point you make, I think, because I think if you think about leadership, there's an instant thought of it being hierarchical rather than actually it's about people's journey, their experience, their knowledge, their ability to think creatively actually can make them a leader within a business, even though they're not a senior manager as such. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we lose sight of the fact that youngsters have new learning, they bring in different things, they have different perspectives. People from different cultures bring in new learning, different things, different perspectives, and all of these different things that we get can shape and change our businesses in a way we hadn't thought of.
So Pete, brings me to a thought around how much thought leadership plays in how the programs of the shows get pulled together, and the topics that get on the agenda, and therefore who gets involved, and whether actually a lot of the people, even in a small way, are thought leaders of some sort. How do you pick up some of those pieces for areas that are not your familiarity, but you need to make a judgment?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And actually, as we've been thinking about this thing about thought leadership, it's sort of made me realise some of the thinking behind that, which I take for granted. There are moments in your life, I'm sure we've all been there, where someone says something to you and it just makes sense, and you think, yes, actually, that makes complete sense in the context that we're talking. I had a similar thing around emotional intelligence when that became a standard phrase, and I realised there was so much intelligent input going on that, frankly, I'd just been living with and operating for a long time. You go, that makes complete sense. It's actually what I've been doing, but I hadn't really boxed it up in that phrase. And this is the same sort of thing. So the programming for the shows is, if we weren't having this conversation in the context of thought leadership, I would say it's very much a process of osmosis. I just enjoy getting out and meeting people, and by having the shows, we have a lot of people who say, what about this, and I think that, and we just meet a lot of different views. And also, actually, over the years, quite often in networking events like this, someone gets excited about something and you think actually it might have a point. Sometimes what I'll simply do in process of several following networking meetings, be it in person, online, I'll just lob in a controversial bit based on what they've been saying and see what happens. And basically the people go yes or no, or they get really interested in it, or they obviously find what you've just said very boring. And actually, when it's before me, you say, okay, I think we might have something here, and then we explode it, and then we find we've got somebody else who's interested in it, and the whole thing. And before you know it, we've got a significant thing either brewing or in existence. Some of those can be really obvious ones, like we were aware that we haven't done much around funding for small micro businesses recently. That's just so blatantly obvious when you're involved in running a business. We've been thinking maybe we should do something about that after a while. Then you get other ones. As somebody said to me, several conversations have ended up with our political system is just absolutely rubbish. It doesn't do anything and serves no purpose. And we started turning that around and asking a few people what they felt about our political system, whether it served their purpose. And the resounding response you got from everyone was saying, what a stupid question. Of course it doesn't. You go, hang on a minute. This is such a unanimous, ubiquitous response. Surely there has to be something. And so this whole political thinking that we do grew up out of that. So you can say all of those. There's no one thought leadership thing going on that says, and therefore by definition this is important. But it's a vast number of micro conversations that actually begin to see a thread, and then we pick it up, and then we reverse engineer it. We find out who actually knows what they're talking about in whatever the area is, put them on stage, invite a few panelists who've got some good experience, and stand back. That's how the show programs get put together in a nutshell.
Fantastic. So Jane, final question for you is, how important is thought leadership for all businesses in terms of running their businesses?
Oh my gosh. Well, from personal experience, huge. All right.
You got
from personal I mean, from my own perspective in my business, it's huge. It's what now enables me to stand in front of my clients and speak to them with confidence, and to help them shape how they run their businesses in terms of the people they've got working with them, and the salaries, and the way that they pay people, and how to do things differently. But I think from a business perspective, just there's so much information out there that is so useful and so helpful, and you come across it by mistake or by design. You did a question, I can't remember the last one, the one before, where you asked which books people were reading and what books have made a difference. Those are all thought leadership books.
Absolutely.
And they all have made a difference one way or another to the people in the room. So, you can't move away from the fact that we need thought leadership to help us grow. We can do the same thing, and by doing the same thing, we'll get the same thing, or we can grow and change our thinking and grow and change our businesses. Gosh, use that one, Pete, as a headline.
Jane, I'm waiting for you to come back with the content proposal. Go for it.
Brilliant. So has anybody got any questions for Pete or Jane about this subject area? Fantastic. So thanks, guys. That was really interesting. I think there's probably quite a few bits in there for various shows and events and panels as well. So we'll pick those up later. Okay.